We may be a couple of weeks into 2021, but today we ask you to cast your minds back to the 2020 F1 season. Welcome back to the Grid Talk podcast. Today we'll be counting down our pick for the top 10 drives of the season. My name is Ruby Price, and joining me are broadcast journalist Louis Edwards.
Hello.
Engineering student Owain Medford.
Hello.
And co-host of the Monkeyseat Podcast, Tom Horrox.
Hiya.
So, Louis, starting off our pick for number 10, Daniel Ricciardo at the Eiffel Grand Prix. It was Renault's first podium since 2011, his first podium with Renault. What made this drive great?
I think it was just the Renaults had been going through a very good sort of like run of form. It was the kind of sort of came out of nowhere. Sort of we sort of been used to Renault being in this sort of midfield battle, but yet to really put up that challenge to McLaren and Racing Point, and then off the back of like Spa and sort of other drives like that, he's boom came through with the podium. I mean, as you said, it was a great drive. However, it was ruined by the commentary for that race, constantly going on about Cyril Abiteboul's tattoo. And I'm glad that we've heard nothing of it since. Well, kind of.
I think that's why he left Renault.
Yeah, I wouldn't blame him. Yeah, it was kind of ruined by that. But otherwise, he did a good job to hang on. Even with the late safety car, he did a great job to hang on to that spot. And he was fully deserving of that podium, that race.
And it could have even been P2, like after the safety car restart, he was challenging Max but then I think I remember him saying that like he was worried that Perez would like get him in turn 4 if he carried on his assault. So he was just kind of like, I'm just going to step back and take what we've got and defend it. So Owain, P9, Perez, Turkey, started in P3, finished in P2. It was he at least delivered on what, we've known Perez to be this season.
Yeah, and most importantly, he didn't go backwards. Obviously, we saw that Stroll started on pole there, and the moment he changed tyres, just kind of imploded, really. I don't think that was any of his fault, but, Perez, on the other hand, managed to stay where he was, make one position and keep it to the end of the race. And it was sort of looking like he was going to be under a bit of pressure, but the fact that he's obviously, one of the old guard at this point in Formula One, kept his head and managed to get a really, really good points finish for the team.
And Tom, on that as well, he obviously had some great defending against a very spinny at the time Verstappen, when his teammate was in the lead, and obviously he had to play the team game part of, just holding him up. Is it possible that, Turkey at least, showed the reason as to why everyone wanted Perez to stick around this season?
Well, yeah, I agree. It was a good performance, but again, he was out qualified by Stroll, which is I think that was more kind of. I mean, Stroll's always shown that he's good in the wet, which is good. But I do think that he kind of he inherited the lead when Stroll then made his pit stop and then just kind of pushed up towards lost the lead to Hamilton and probably should have lost second to Leclerc as well had Leclerc not made his error. So I think it's kind of I think it was a great drive, but it wasn't like one of the top drives of the season. He definitely deserves to be in the top 10, but certainly no higher than it is, in my opinion. It was a good drive and showed that he definitely had what it took and could finally get that Racing Point on the podium where it should have been for a lot of the season.
9th and 10th, pretty much, where he's finished, particularly based on the fact he's got the same amount of points based on our system as Daniel Ricciardo in the Eiffel Grand Prix. So either or. So I'm going to stick with you, Tom, because you've not had the chance yet. But P8, Hamilton in the British Grand Prix, started P1, finished P1. Doesn't normally sound like, a great drive, but he finished on 3 wheels. And that's the thing that's made it show up in this list, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a classic Hamilton performance leading. I think it was lights to flag. He showed great composure, great pace, but it was the fact that he drove 3/4 of the lap on 3 wheels and had the presence of mind to lock the diff and didn't panic at all. I mean, he on paper, when you look at some of the other races that he's done this year, it was it was no better than a lot of those races. But just the fact that last lap and managing to stay calm and even getting it back to the paddock on the cool down lap as well, without having to pull over at the side of the track, without wrecking the car. Very good. But again, I think there was other performances that deserve to be higher up.
I was watching the highlights in preparation for this episode, and Lewis isn't in it really until the end. He's there at the start, and he's there at the end, and that just kind of shows the race that you just described. Classic Hamilton. So, Louis, on to P7. Lando Norris in Austria, the first race of the 2020 season. Started P3, finished P3, but he was P5 with 2 low, and this is where we got last lap Lando. It was certainly a strong performance from him.
Yeah, it was a great quali. I think it was just overall a really good weekend for Lando Norris. The McLaren did seem to struggle somewhat with their race pace. It did definitely look like their gains in qualifying were going to be mitigated by the fact that the racing points were very quick in the race. However, he did an astonishing job to bounce back and fight for that podium. It was so tense. Lewis got his penalty after taking out Albon, and yeah, he took the opportunity, got past Carlos, absolutely just went for it. I think he got past one of the racing points as well.
Perez, yeah.
Yeah, it was an incredible sort of last 2 laps. I was absolutely on the edge of my seat, screaming at the telly, hoping that he got it. And yeah, he did, and it was such a relief because we all know how good Lando Norris is, and it was good for him to start the season so strongly.
McLaren's second podium since 2014, with Carlos Sainz obviously inheriting the podium in Brazil. And again, it was another one where Hamilton received a penalty for taking out Albon. But as Louis mentioned, this was the perfect start for Lando Norris.
Yeah, it was absolutely excellent. For his ability to sort of be coached round and actually just get the podium. It really helped, I think, push McLaren's prospects, and it was good to see that he could actually not just sort of sit back and go, well, I'm not going to get the the podium position, but actually think, I'll stay in touch. As much as he was coached round, it takes the ability of the driver to be actually to pull it off and actually sort of seal the better points finish, and he managed it. So going from middling position and starting the season off right it was great.
Exactly. So, Tom, in P6, we've got Max Verstappen at the 70th anniversary Grand Prix. Started P4, finished P1. This was when the W11 was untouchable and Max Verstappen bested them. How did you do it?
Yeah, it's still confusing. I mean, I still think that Mercedes, why they qualified on that tyre, I have no idea. But Verstappen pushed them hard on the harder compound, pushed Bottas and Hamilton into going faster than they wanted to do, which was a good enough job in its own right. Having to make the early stops, had strong pace in the middle stint, and then made the second stop. He could have taken a risk and gone for it, but he had confidence in his own ability to then make the second stop. He could have tried to drag it out to try and just hold on, but he knew that he would be able to keep that pace. I think a lot of it was the circumstances on the cars. Something just wasn't right with the Mercedes in those temperatures with those tyres. I think that was more the circumstance for it, but equally he was able to execute it. And as the commentators said at the time, thank goodness for Max Verstappen, because without him, there would have been no championship fight at all. I mean, there wasn't a championship fight, but there would have been nothing. It would have been like 2014 with just the Mercedes fighting out and Bottas not really giving any kind of fight back.
For sure, definitely. So Louis, P5, Carlos Sainz, Italy. There are many, some amongst us who would argue that maybe P5 and P4 should be swapped around, but Carlos Sainz in Italy obviously showed again McLaren were there, and they have very much become, or at least are on that trajectory to be the team that they used to be.
Yeah, the McLaren were the second fastest car that weekend. I think it was quite evident from the start. Both Lando and Carlos getting ahead of Bottas had an absolute stinker of a start, and then they just continued on that way. And then it felt kind of like a series of unfortunate events for Carlos, despite the fact that he got second. He looked to benefit from the fact that Lewis had screwed up with his pit stop. However, Gasly hadn't pitted before, didn't pit under the safety car, so he'd pitted before the safety car period had started. So he then leapfrogged them all, and then the Alfa Romeos also didn't do it. So he had to fight through them before he could even get up to Gasly, and by then I'm sure Carlos's tyres weren't in the best of condition, so it didn't really allow him to push on Gasly probably as much as he wanted. And if the race was one lap longer, he probably would have won it. But ifs and buts. But you can't say what for certain what would have happened. But it was a great drive by Carlos. I think he always kept in there. He always, even when his team were telling him just settle for P2, mate, he knew he could have a chance at winning. And I think any driver in his position would have tried to take the opportunity. And I think he did a great job at the end of the day.
I mean, I remember hearing the radio message of just, I want this win, Tom. And like, that's probably going to stick with Carlos, like, until he finally does get that win. But it was nice to see him just fighting for, albeit Lewis obviously got a penalty. But it would have been a legitimate win for the McLarens as well, wouldn't it, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was nice of him to tell me that he wanted to win. I appreciate the thought. Thank you, Carlos. He was. He qualified third on merit. He passed Bottas on merit. He outdragged him to the first turn. That was before Bottas thought he had a puncher. So that was on merit. He didn't make any mistakes. He didn't make the mistake that Hamilton made, given that he was only a few seconds back from Hamilton, about 10 seconds back from Hamilton at the time of the pit stops. His team didn't make that error. So he was, if there'd have been the red flag straight away, he would have been the person that inherited the lead and drove to an easy victory. But unfortunately, that's what happens, really. There's been times when they've benefited from red flags and safety cars, and this was one of the times where, unfortunately, when the McLarens were second and third, they were quite heavily inconvenienced by it.
Now, Owain, who I would like to assure the people watching the video is still here. On to P4, Gasly in Italy. We've already talked about his main competitor in that race, Carlos Sainz. But Gasly started P10, finished P1, got his first F1 win. And yeah, that's the headline really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's come about at a time, or it came about at a time that sort of it didn't look good. Bearing in mind he'd been replaced, previously by Albon. Sorry. Bearing in mind that he'd been replaced previously by Albon, for Gasly to get a win before Albon did was it showed a lot. And as much as it was a silly race, he was there to capitalise on it. He started, as you said, P10, but he just made sure that he didn't get caught up in any accidents. He wasn't, as George Russell might have said, he wasn't in the mess ups. So he was allowed to profit from it, and and even though he came under pressure from Sainz, the fact that he could hold off that pressure just until the last lap, which is all you really need to do, because no one really remembers who would have got someone a lap later. He's taken the points, he's got the full 25, and that's possibly why he's rated sort of fifth on this list rather than sixth. I think it came at a time where it just showed how good Gasly actually is, just given the opportunity, and confirms what we've all known, that he is a good driver. He's just, sort of been wilted under the shadow of Max Verstappen.
Yeah, even if he is in P4 rather than P5. But also, as you mentioned, Gasly got a podium and a win before Albon got his second podium for Red Bull. And they were both in the weaker car, in inverted commas. So let's move on to the top three. So, Tom, George Russell and Sakir. There are some people who might say that this is just the car. He obviously would have had a very different race if he'd been in his own Williams car, which ironically might have caused him not winning this race. But yeah, P2 to P9, we normally wouldn't be putting that kind of result this high, would we?
No, absolutely not. It really really ignited the arguments from the people saying whether it's the car or the driver. You know, them saying, "Oh, it's definitely the car," and you know, just like a week earlier, everyone was saying about just how good Hamilton is, and then as soon as Russell jumps in his car, everyone's talking about how good Russell is and how good the car is. And but yeah, I mean, the reason that it's clearly in there, people don't. You know, sorry, the cat's being really needy at the moment. He's just playing with the microphone, so I apologize if you hear any background noise there. Yes, so I mean, he passed his teammate twice on track. Granted, one was with a significant tire advantage. He made no mistakes, and he, even with the earlier issue, having to make an extra pit stop, he still could have won the race, which just shows the maturity of performance. And the more experienced guy in the car that's been in there all season, been in the same team for years, he didn't deliver, and Russell did. So that's having to make 3 pit stops instead of 1, and still finishing in the points. A few more laps, he would have gained a few more positions as well. So yeah, that's obviously, you know, everyone don't need me to tell you that's why he's in there. It was a sport-changing performance, that race.
And Louis, it was kind of a classic example of the Formula One argument of never give up. He had that tyres mess up and he still came back. He had the puncture. Some weird conspiracy theorists might argue he didn't, but he had a puncture. Mercedes wouldn't just throw that away. You know, he very much just showed his worth in Sakir.
Or would they throw it away? I don't know. No, honestly, George's performance, and it's just his sort of ability to, you know, he's been knocked down, come back, been knocked down, and then just try and just do the best he can. You could tell at the end, you know, he was, I mean, of course he would be devastated that he couldn't win that, but you could tell that race, it took a lot out of him. You know, it takes someone else, you know, to be pushed back so many times to then, you know, and then still come through. He still got, at the end of the day, you know, we thought that he didn't get his win or a podium, but he did get his first points in Formula One, which is something he should be proud of. I think if he hadn't got that drive, perhaps his long record of races with that point could have continued well into next season. So I think he definitely should be proud of himself that he did get those points, and you know, he was at least on the board this season. Didn't get outscored by his his Williams teammate. But no, George should be incredibly happy with that result, and I think it was well deserved. It was incredibly well deserved.
Absolutely. So, Owain, on to this person would normally be like number 1 on the list for almost every year, but for this year, Hamilton, Turkey, P2, P2 in this list. He started P6, he finished P1. The final timesheet says that he won by 30 seconds, but it was anything but a simple Hamilton race, you know. Just what is it about Turkey that's put, you know, both Lewis on this list and all the others earlier, but also just this high?
I think it's the fact that he's gone from P6 to P1, but that again, like you say, belies the fact that it was anything but simple. You know, we've obviously the tarmac had only been laid recently. It was a completely new surface, and I think Mercedes themselves admitted you needed to have almost the sort of wrong setup for the car. That they've been working for years on getting the car to not use its tires so much, and the one time that they needed, you know, in a cold setting with a lot of greasiness, you needed the sort of worst car design, as it were. But nevertheless, he managed to sort of inch his way up and really drive around the problem. You know, drive the intermediate tires to the point where, yeah, they did look like slicks, and when there was an opportunity to move to slicks, not to take that opportunity. You know, knowing when to stick on the tires you've got with, you know, heat and pressure, and not have to rebuild that into a completely new compound. Admittedly, that's probably partly the team as well. But I think, you know, Hamilton knows himself as well how to, at this point, get the best out of his tires, drive in a way that isn't going to cause him to make silly mistakes or spin, as we've seen his contemporaries do in similar conditions. You know, to know when not to go for what looks like an easy overtake, and to just sort of pace yourself around, and it's brought him to the front. And as much as yeah, there's argument as to whether that would go to the top of the list. I still think it's a damn good performance, and one we've come to expect from probably the best. Well, I would say the best driver of his generation.
Tom, do you have anything to add to that?
I think it was pretty well summed up by Owen, really. But I mean, the only thing I can really think of is, I think that's pretty much summed it up. I mean, he was stuck behind Vettel for a while, but as you say, he didn't take the risk on the overtake when it wasn't necessary. So no, I think that's pretty much summed it up there.
All right, so on to the final number one, Louis. Sergio Perez in Sakir didn't have the bad luck they had the weekend before, still in Sakir, but on a different layout. But P5 to P1 via being last at the end of the first lap.
Yeah, it was an incredible performance. It's something that we've kind of taken for granted with Sergio Perez and his ability. His ability to nurse tires and just nurse his car and just keep up consistent pace is it's incredible. And I don't think you could ever take that away from him. His ability to just go on very, very long stretches to just only take little bits out of his tires each lap. But yeah, he got caught up in an unfortunate incident with Leclerc, and then he was kind of lucky with the safety car that he could just, join at the back. But you still got to get through all those cars. And there was some fierce battles going on, especially at the midfield between the Renaults and the Racing Points. He managed to navigate them, and he was passing people left, right, centre, and he was doing an incredible job. And after all the pit stop mess with Mercedes, you then sort of look at the top and go, "Oh my God, it's Sergio Perez is at the top, is at the front of the pack." And despite the sort of the pressure that George Russell was putting on him, and it looked like George Russell would get past him, he still held his own. And I think it was just a staple Sergio Perez drive. And it's been so long since it's his first ever win in Formula One, and I think he's done it in the most Sergio Perez fashion possible.
Yeah, that's certainly a very Sergio Perez fashion. Owain, it was 10 seconds to the next car on Sergio Perez. Obviously, there's the whole, would it have happened if Russell hadn't had the puncture and we hadn't had the safety car and stuff? But that's a commanding win, particularly in a car that should, in normal circumstances, be a midfield car.
Yeah, it should have been a midfield car, and you'd have expected other drivers to have to maybe taken the fight to him a bit more. There was obviously circumstances that meant that they didn't, but the performance belies the car. I think as much as you can go on about Racing Point as much as you like, for the majority of the season, it hadn't put out, apart from some obvious exceptions in this list alone, it hadn't put out amazing performances, particularly when you'd have expected it to. But Perez, kind of extracted the best from the car, and I think he managed to build that gap and just kind of show why he's in a Red Bull seat at this point. He may be one of the most experienced on the grid, but I think that's added to the performance. That's explained why he's there, and explains what's happened. You can, like you say, you can argue Russell probably would have won without his obvious issues, but the fact is that Russell did have issues, and Perez was there to win it.
Yeah, exactly. Tom, do you have anything else to add?
Yes. This was not my top choice. This was actually my fourth choice, but my second choice didn't even make the top 10. So what do I know? But I mean, the reason I put it as my fourth choice was because he was spun around on lap one, and he made great progress through the field. But his spin was somewhat negated by the safety car, and then as a result, at the restart, he was only 8 seconds off the lead. As I said, he did make good progress through the teams, through the other drivers, took advantage of the other drivers when they made their stops. So he had the advantage over them, but he was a full pit stop behind the Mercedes before they threw it away. They would have come out in front of him had it not been for the problems. And when you look at you say he won commandingly, but there was nobody behind him that shouldn't have been behind him. I mean, granted, yeah, the reason it's in the top 10 was because of his great drive through the field, but he didn't. You say it's a midfield car, it was still the third best car, and both Mercedes had problems, and Verstappen crashed, and Albon is Albon. So for me, that means he probably should have been the winner on paper had he not been spun around on lap 1. So yes, great recovery, but it's where he should have been, in my opinion, which is why I didn't put it as number 1.
That's a good justification, I think. So I'm going to provide the opportunity because you've just mentioned like some of yours didn't even make the top 10. So does anybody have any honourable mentions for this list? Let's start with you, Tom, since you've already mentioned that something didn't.
Well, my second place was Charles Leclerc in Austria, which pains me because Charles Leclerc is not my favourite driver, but this was a great performance, starting 7th, and then we had Lando Norris in, I think was he 9th or 8th in the list for his Austria performance, or 7th. Well, there we go. And Leclerc did a better job in a slower car that weekend. He started 7th. He shadowed Norris for most of the race and then barreled past him, and passed Perez on track, and then was well ahead. Good few seconds up the road from Norris with a slower car. So for me, if you've got Norris in the top 10, then surely Leclerc should have been there. And so he was actually my number 2 because I thought that was the outlying result for the entire season, really. When you look back at the end of the season, knowing what you know now, and you look at all the results and you see Leclerc in second, how did that happen? So for me, that's was right up there.
That's a good. I think I had Leclerc on my list as well. Louis, did you have any honourable mentions that didn't get mentioned?
I had a couple. I had, so my 10th place was Leclerc in Portimao. I thought he did a brilliant job. He really took the fight to the midfield teams, really showed some great pace in that Ferrari, considering he didn't qualify in the best position either. So I think it was a great job by Leclerc that weekend. And then in 5th spot, I had Hulkenberg at the Eiffel Grand Prix. It may not have been the greatest Hulkenberg performance we've ever seen, but the fact that he hadn't jumped in the car before qualifying. He was only a few tenths off the back in qualifying, and then charged through during the race, doing an excellent job, and ended up P9. So I was sad that no one else put him high enough to get him on the list.
I think a lot of people might argue that everyone had reduced running at the Nürburgring that weekend because obviously P1 and P2 were just written off by the rain, and then that kind of showed in the race, and we had a really entertaining race because no one knew what was going to happen. But yeah, Hulkenberg in the Eiffel Grand Prix.
I had him in my top 10 as well, if that helps, Louis.
Owain.
I'm going to go with Leclerc at Great Britain because he got a Ferrari to where it should have been. Not that Ferrari, but he got a Ferrari to where Ferraris should be finishing almost all the time with the kind of budget they've got. And as much as we see very, very good drivers wilt in the or look kind of mediocre under Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton. That's not a position I'd want to be in. I wouldn't want to be Leclerc's teammate either. He's absolutely astounding, and some of that could be due to Ferrari and how they design their car now. But still, to take a woefully down on power, not particularly aero efficient Ferrari and take it to, I believe it was 2nd place. I think that's why I put it there in Great Britain. 3rd.
Well. Oh wait, no.
If it's a podium position, it's still astounding for a car that is, just useless. Probably one of the worst things that Maranello has put out in a long, long time. And
yeah, it was third.
Yeah. Because obviously Max Verstappen was coming right up behind Lewis for 2nd and 1st. So
yeah, it's just okay. Admittedly, tyre issues aside, but still, he's managed that would have meant it was 5th, and I still think that would have been a great driver of the season at that point. It's a really poor car. Like, we're talking 14th place, typically, and for him to qualify and race that car as well as he did, it shows to me that he's going to be a world champion one day.
Like the fact that Ferrari got several podiums this year amongst both of its drivers, which is probably the more shocking, part. after the season that Sebastian Vettel had. It's just astounding that, I think it's a little bit unfair perhaps that there isn't a Charles Leclerc performance on this list. And speaking of this list, to give it a roundup, in P10 we had Daniel Ricciardo at the Eiffel Grand Prix. In P9 we had Perez in Turkey. In P8 we had Hamilton at the British Grand Prix. In P7 we had Norris in Austria. In P6 we had Verstappen at the 70th anniversary Grand Prix. In P5 Sainz in Italy. In P4 Gasly in Italy. In P3 Russell in Sakir. In P2 Hamilton in Turkey. And the number one spot for our driver of the 2020 season was Sergio Perez in Sakir. And I feel like that is a pretty rounded list, maybe missing a few, but anyway. So, we are now on Amazon Music, YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Music, Omni Studio, and Pocket Casts. You just search for the F1 Grid Talk podcast. We have a huge back catalogue of shows with previews and reactions to qualifying and race results. We have a subreddit, the F1 Grid Talk, and we have a Patreon for mics, lights, and better recording equipment for our presenters. We'll be back soon for more F1 content. Thank you very much to my panelists for joining me.
No worries.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.